In 1666, a single spark in a baker's oven ignited a firestorm that devoured London, destroying 13,000 homes and 87 churches in 4 days, yet only 6 lives were lost. How did a city burn to ashes without burning its people? Uncover the gripping tales of survival, sacrifice, and the desperate fight against the Great Fire of London. In 1666, a baker's oven sparked a blaze that razed London to the ground, obliterating 13,000 homes and 87 churches, yet miraculously claiming only 6 lives. How did the city burn without burning its people? Dive into the wild tales of survival, desperate choices, and bizarre firefighting in the Great Fire of London. Over 13,000 houses gone in 4 days. 87 churches reduced to ash. Nearly every major building in London completely obliterated. And here's the number that'll really mess with your head. Only 6 confirmed deaths. 6 from the most destructive fire in English history. How the hell does a fire destroy an entire city and kill almost no one? That's what I kept asking myself while researching this story. And I'll tell you what, the answers are wild. Not just about who survived, but how they survived. The choices they made in split seconds. The stuff they saved instead of their neighbors. The desperate, often bizarre attempts to stop the flames. So tonight it's the Great Fire of London. But wait, are you comfortable? No, really. Check. Pillows, blankets, whatever you need. This one's worth being cozy for. Alright, so you're waking up in London, September 1666. First thing that hits you is the smell. Not fire. Not yet. It's the everyday stench of a medieval city. Imagine raw sewage, rotting food, and the sour sweet tang of bodies that haven't bathed in months, all mixing together in the summer heat. Unlike your clean sheets right now, your bed is just a lumpy straw mattress on a wooden frame, maybe with a wool blanket if you're doing all right for yourself. The houses in London were packed together like matchsticks in a box. And not just side by side. They actually got wider as they went up. Each floor jutted out over the street below. So buildings on opposite sides nearly touched at the top. They called this jettying. And it was basically a real estate hack to get more square footage without taking up more ground space. You know those cute half-timbered buildings you see in fairy tales? That's what most of London was made of. Wooden frames filled with wattle and daub. Basically twigs woven together and packed with mud mixed with horsehair, dung, and straw. Super flammable, especially after the dry summer and living memory had turned everything into perfect kindling. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me set the scene properly. It's Saturday night, September 1st, 1666. King Charles II has been on the throne for 6 years. The Great Plague that killed 1/5 of London's population has just ended. People are finally feeling hopeful again. Down on Pudding Lane near London Bridge, Thomas Farriner is closing up his bakery for the night. The name of the street, by the way, had nothing to do with dessert. It came from the puddings, which weren't sweet treats, but intestines and organs from the nearby meat market. That would be washed down the hill. Gross, right? But that was London for you. A city of about 350,000 people crammed inside medieval walls, living literally on top of each other in wooden fire traps. Master Farriner, shall I bank the ovens? His apprentice called out. I've already seen to it, Thomas replied, wiping flour from his hands. The fire's out. Go get some sleep. Thomas Farriner was no amateur. He was the king's own baker, supplying bread to the Royal Navy. He knew how to handle ovens safely. At least that's what he would later claim in court. After checking his ovens one last time, or so he said, Farriner went upstairs with his family, his daughter Hannah, his son, and a maid whose name nobody bothered to record. They all went to bed, unaware that below them something was smoldering. Maybe it was an ember that escaped the oven. Maybe it was a spark that landed on a pile of kindling. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that around 1 a.m. the baker's house was suddenly filled with smoke and flames. The Farriners woke up to a nightmare. Fire had already engulfed the ground floor, blocking the stairs. Their only escape was through an upstairs window. Thomas, his son, and his daughter managed to climb out onto the roof of the neighboring house. But the maid, too terrified of heights to follow them, stayed behind and became the first victim of what would soon be known as the Great Fire of London. Can you imagine that moment of choice? The flames below you, the drop above you, and having to decide which way to die. While you're snug in your bed right now, safe and warm, think about what you'd do if your only escape was through a window with nothing but a sheer drop below. By 2 a.m., the baker's house was fully ablaze, and the fire had spread to the Star Inn next door. The inn stables were filled with hay and straw, perfect fuel. From there, the flames leapt across to the warehouses along Thames Street. And here's where things went from bad to catastrophic. The warehouses were packed with oil, tallow, and other highly flammable goods. When the fire reached them, it didn't just burn, it exploded. Eyewitnesses said the materials actually combusted before the flames even touched them, just from the intense heat radiating through the air. Fire! Fire! The cries started to echo through the narrow streets. Church bells began to ring out the alarm, starting with Street Magnus the Martyr, just down the road from Pudding Lane. People spilled out of their homes in nightshirts and caps, sleepy-eyed and confused at first, then increasingly panicked as they saw the glow in the sky. It's just another fire, some said dismissively. London had small fires all the time. Every neighborhood had its leather buckets and fire hooks to pull down burning buildings, but this was different. This fire was hungry. By 3 a.m., the fire had consumed about 300 houses and was growing rapidly. A man named Samuel Pepys, who worked for the Navy office, was woken by his maid with news of the fire. Pepys, like many others, wasn't too concerned at first. He peeped out his window, thought it was far enough off. Meanwhile, somebody had the good sense to alert the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. As the city's leader, he had the authority to order buildings demolished to create fire breaks, the main firefighting technique of the time. When Bloodworth arrived at Pudding Lane, people were already begging him to authorize demolitions. But Bloodworth hesitated. "Pish," he reportedly said, looking at the flames. "A woman might piss it out." Those words would come back to haunt him. The fire that a woman could supposedly extinguish with her urine would go on to destroy most of his city. In Bloodworth's defense, ordering buildings demolished was a big deal. Most Londoners rented their homes, and destroying property meant facing angry landlords and potential lawsuits. Plus, it was the middle of the night. The property owners weren't around to give permission. So, Bloodworth went back to bed, promising to return in the morning when things were clearer. By then, it would be too late. As dawn broke on Sunday, September 2nd, a rare and terrible thing happened. The fire created its own weather. The heat was so intense that it generated powerful updrafts, sucking in air from all directions and creating what we'd now call a firestorm. Worse still, a strong east wind had picked up, pushing the flames westward through the heart of the city. Over on Seething Lane, Samuel Pepys was woken again at 7 a.m. This time, when he looked out, he could see that the situation was serious. Hurriedly dressing, he went out to assess the damage. What he saw shocked him. The fire had grown exponentially in just a few hours. Pepys took a boat on the Thames to get a better view, and from the river he could see the whole waterfront ablaze. The warehouses were all in one flame, he wrote in his diary. And the poor residents were frantically trying to save their belongings. "People are bringing their goods to the river in boats and barges," Pepys recorded, watching the chaos unfold. "Good Lord, what a sight! Hold up. Let me paint you a picture of what Pepys was seeing." The Thames was jammed with boats of every size, from little rowboats to larger barges. People were throwing whatever they could grab into these vessels. Furniture, clothing, trade goods, family heirlooms. Some were even flinging stuff directly into the river, figuring wet belongings were better than burned ones. On the shore, it was pure mayhem. People running with armloads of possessions, horses and carts trying to navigate streets clogged with panicked crowds, shopkeepers attempting to salvage their inventory. Pepys was so alarmed by what he saw that he decided to go straight to the king at Whitehall Palace. Charles II needed to know how serious the situation had become. When Pepys arrived, he found King Charles and his brother James, Duke of York, had already heard about the fire, but had no idea of its scale. After hearing Pepys's first-hand account, the king immediately ordered James to take charge of firefighting efforts. Meanwhile, back in the burning city, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The fire was now a massive, roaring beast, consuming everything in its path. The heat was so intense that it could be felt from hundreds of yards away. The noise was terrifying, a constant roar punctuated by the crash of collapsing buildings and occasional explosions as barrels of oil or gunpowder ignited. And there was something else, a disturbing rumor spreading almost as fast as the fire itself. This was no accident, people whispered. It was an attack. The French, the Dutch, even Catholics. Someone had deliberately set London ablaze. In times of crisis, humans look for someone to blame. And England in 1666 had plenty of enemies. They were at war with both France and the Netherlands. Anti-Catholic sentiment ran high. It didn't take much for fear to transform into deadly suspicion. "I saw a Frenchman being set upon," one witness later reported. The mob had convinced themselves he was carrying fireballs to spread the flames. They nearly beat him to death before soldiers intervened. As night fell on that first day, London presented an apocalyptic scene. A third of the city was now in flames. The fire formed a wall that stretched nearly half a mile wide. The sky glowed an eerie orange-red, visible from miles away. Sparks and burning debris rained down like a hellish snowstorm, and still the fire grew. In the wealthy neighborhood of Lombard Street, far from where the fire had started, a banker named Robert Viner was making rapid calculations, not of money, but of time. How long until the flames reached his mansion? What could he save? What would he have to abandon? Unlike the poor residents of Pudding Lane, Viner had resources. He hired every available cart and porter to move his gold, his jewelry, his documents, and his most valuable possessions to safety. He sent his family ahead while he stayed to oversee the evacuation of his wealth. "Take it to Windsor Castle," he instructed his most trusted servants, leveraging his connection to the king to secure the safest storage possible for his treasures. As you lie there in your comfortable bed, imagine the choice between saving your family photos or your financial documents, your cherished keepsakes, or the deed to your house. What would you grab if you had minutes to decide before everything you own turned to ash? For the wealthy, like Viner, the fire meant inconvenience and financial loss. For the poor, it meant absolute destitution. They had nowhere to go, no country estates to retreat to, no powerful friends to shelter them. By midnight on that first day, the fire had claimed over 1,000 buildings. The city gates were jammed with people trying to flee, carrying whatever they could on their backs. The fields north of the city were already filling with refugees huddled around their salvaged possessions. And the fire, that remorseless, hungry fire, showed no signs of stopping. Sunday was ending, but London's nightmare was just beginning. Remember how I mentioned those warehouses by the river? Let me tell you what was actually in them, because it's wild. One had whale oil. Another had tallow, basically animal fat used for candles. There were stores of pitch, tar, hemp, and timber. It was like someone had gathered the world's most flammable materials and stacked them all together, just waiting for a spark. When these warehouses caught fire, they didn't just burn. They created temperatures hot enough to melt iron. One witness described seeing the iron chains on London Bridge glowing red-hot before they failed. In your cozy modern bed, it's hard to imagine that kind of heat. The kind that makes stone explode and metal run like water. The kind that creates its own wind system, feeding itself, growing stronger with everything it consumes. As the first day of the Great Fire came to an end, Londoners faced an uncomfortable truth. This was no ordinary blaze. This was something unprecedented, unstoppable, biblical in its scale, and the worst was yet to come. Dawn broke on Monday, September 3rd, day 2 of the fire. Anyone hoping the flames might die down overnight was in for a bitter disappointment. The fire hadn't weakened. It had grown stronger, angrier, hungrier. If you'd managed to get any sleep at all, you'd wake to a city transformed. The sky wasn't blue anymore. It was a churning mix of black smoke and orange glow that blocked out the sun. The air scratched at your lungs with every breath. Your eyes watered constantly, and the noise, the constant roar of the flames, the crash of falling buildings, and the desperate shouts of people trying to save what they could. Let me show you what was happening on the ground. Picture a wall of fire, 30 feet high in some places, advancing through the narrow streets like a living thing. The heat was so intense that buildings would catch fire before the flames even touched them. Windows would shatter from thermal stress. Paint would bubble and peel. And then when the main fire front hit, structures that had stood for centuries would be consumed in minutes. It's moving faster than a man can walk, one witness reported. Think about that. A fire so powerful you couldn't outpace it by walking. By Monday morning, the fire had reached the financial heart of the city. The Royal Exchange, London's first purpose-built trading centre, and it was directly in its path. Inside this grand building, merchants from across Europe and beyond conducted the business that made London one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Save what you can. The cry went up as traders rushed to secure their goods. The exchange housed countless valuable commodities. Silks from China, spices from India, gold and silver from the Americas. Nicholas Barbon, a prominent merchant, watched in horror as the flames approached. 10 years of trade gone in an instant, he muttered, clutching a ledger to his chest. God help us all. But neither God nor man seemed capable of stopping this inferno. By mid-morning the Royal Exchange was fully ablaze. Its stone columns, which everyone thought would withstand the flames, glowed red-hot before cracking and collapsing under their own weight. The noise and cracking and thunder of the impetuous flames, wrote diarist John Evelyn. The shrieking of women and children, the hurry of people, the fall of towers, houses, and churches was like a hideous storm. Look, I know it's hard to grasp just how catastrophic this was. So, let me put it in modern terms. Imagine if Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange, and the Federal Reserve all caught fire simultaneously. That's basically what happened to London's economy that Monday morning. By noon, panic had truly set in. The fire was spreading in all directions now, though the easterly winds still drove it primarily westward. People who had initially stayed to protect their properties were abandoning that plan, grabbing whatever they could carry and joining the exodus from the city. The streets were pure chaos. If you'd been there, you'd have seen carts piled high with household goods, furniture, merchandise, anything people could salvage. Rich merchants hired teams of men to move their valuable stock. The poor carried what they could on their backs or dragged it on makeshift sleds. And the prices for transportation, absolute highway robbery. Carters and porters were charging 20, 30, 50 times their usual rates. What would normally cost a shilling suddenly cost £2, more than a month's wages for an average worker. £5 to take your trunk to more fields, a carter shouted at a desperate family. That's daylight theft, the father protested. The carter just shrugged. Find someone else then. Good luck with that. That was the brutal reality. Supply and demand at its most cutthroat, and many simply couldn't afford to pay. Forced to abandon everything they owned. Meanwhile, our shoemaker, Sybil Tame, who worked at Christ's Hospital School, was getting increasingly nervous. The fire was still a good distance from her workshop, but she could see the smoke darkening the sky and smell the burning. The rumble of the distant flames sounded like an approaching storm. They say it'll never reach this far, her eldest daughter said, trying to sound confident. Sybil wasn't convinced. Your father always said, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Start packing our tools. She was wise to be cautious. This fire was breaking all the rules, defying all expectations. By early afternoon, King Charles II and his brother James, Duke of York, had taken personal command of firefighting efforts. This wasn't just for show. Charles actually rolled up his sleeves and joined bucket chains, passing water from person to person in a desperate bid to douse the flames. Imagine that. The King of England sweating alongside bakers and blacksmiths. His fine clothes smeared with soot, his hands blistered from the rough buckets. It was unprecedented and it made an impression. People still tell stories about it today. Never seen anything like it. A dock worker named John Garfield later told his grandchildren. There I was, passing a bucket to the next man. And who should reach for it but King Charles himself, his wig all askew, face black with smoke, working harder than his own gardeners. The king didn't just provide manual labor. He also issued orders that would have been politically difficult for anyone else. He authorized the large-scale demolition of buildings to create fire breaks, essentially sacrificing parts of the city to save the rest. But by Monday afternoon, even these measures seemed futile. The fire was just too powerful, too fast. It jumped fire breaks. It ignited buildings that should have been safely out of reach. And it was accomplishing this terrifying feat through a mechanism that most Londoners didn't understand. Ember attack. Here's how it worked. The intense heat of the main fire created powerful updrafts which carried burning debris embers high into the air. These embers could travel hundreds of yards, sometimes even half a mile before coming back down. And when they landed on wooden roofs or thatch that had been baking in the summer heat for months, they created new fires far ahead of the main blaze. So while firefighters struggled to contain the fire at one location, 3 new fires might spring up behind their lines. It was like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head and 2 more appear. By late afternoon, the situation had become so dire that Charles ordered troops to assist with evacuation and firefighting. The king's own lifeguards, normally responsible for his personal protection, were deployed to help civilians and maintain order. They were needed because as fear spread, so did suspicion. "It's the Dutch," someone would shout, pointing at a foreign-looking person. "They're setting fires, or Catholics did this papist plot." In times of crisis, humans often look for scapegoats. And in 1666, England, with its religious tensions and ongoing war with the Netherlands, foreigners and Catholics made convenient targets. Several innocent people were attacked by mobs. A young French watchmaker was nearly beaten to death before soldiers intervened. A Portuguese merchant had his house looted because someone claimed they saw him throwing fireballs. This isn't just ancient history, by the way. We still do this. When things go bad, we still look for someone different to blame, something to think about as you lie there in your comfortable bed, safe from both fire and mob justice. As evening approached on that second day, the fire reached Cheapside, London's main market street. Here you would have found the city's finest shops selling jewelry, textiles, and luxury goods from around the world. All of it fed the flames. Our bookseller, Joshua Curtin, was growing increasingly alarmed. His shop near St. Paul's Cathedral wasn't yet threatened. But after seeing what had happened to the Royal Exchange, he wasn't taking any chances. Everything of value into the cathedral, he instructed his apprentices. The stone walls will protect our stock. It seemed like a sound plan. St. Paul's was one of the largest stone buildings in Europe. If anything could withstand the fire, surely it would be the cathedral with its massive walls and spacious crypt. Joshua wasn't alone in this thinking. All across the city, people were moving their valuables into stone churches, believing them to be fireproof havens. St. Paul's crypt was rapidly filling with books, furniture, clothing, and merchant goods. "There's no safer place in London," Joshua assured a fellow bookseller as they wedged their precious inventory into the increasingly crowded space. "Even if the whole city burns, St. Paul's will stand." If only he knew how wrong he was. As night fell on Monday, the fire formed a crescent of destruction nearly a mile wide. The glow from the flames was so bright that according to reports, people could read by it at midnight as far away as Windsor, over 20 m distant. For those still in the city, sleep was impossible. Not just because of the light and noise, but because of the constant fear that the fire might suddenly change direction and trap them. Every shift in the wind brought fresh panic. Many simply gave up on the idea of rest and continued moving their possessions through the night. The streets remained filled with carts and people illuminated by the hellish glow of their burning city. Our banker, Robert Viner, had successfully evacuated his most valuable possessions to Windsor Castle, but he remained in London, staying just ahead of the flames, trying to salvage what he could from his various properties and investments. "The exchange is gone," his steward reported, finding Viner directing servants at one of his warehouses. "And my offices?" Viner asked, already knowing the answer. "Nothing remains, sir." Not a brick standing. Viner had lost the equivalent of millions in modern currency. But unlike the poor residents of London, he had investments elsewhere, properties in the country, connections at court. He would survive this financial catastrophe. Many others would not be so fortunate. In fact, walking through London that night, you'd have seen the stark divide between rich and poor, made even more obvious by the fire. The wealthy hired men to protect their properties or move their goods. They had options, places to go, resources to fall back on. The poor had none of this. Many simply sat on bundles of salvaged possessions in the fields outside the city, watching their homes and livelihoods turn to ash, with no idea what would come next. "Where will we go?" a woman asked her husband as they huddled with their children in Moor Fields, one of the open spaces north of the city that had become a refugee camp. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we're alive. We'll figure something out." That sentiment, "we're alive, we'll figure something out," captures something essential about human resilience, something to remember next time you're facing your own personal disaster, though hopefully not one as catastrophic as the Great Fire. As Monday turned to Tuesday, the third day of the fire, the wind showed no signs of dropping. If anything, it was strengthening, driving the flames ever westward with frightening speed. The fire had now consumed most of the area inside London's city walls, but it wasn't content to stay there. It pushed beyond the walls, threatening the wealthy districts to the west and the seat of government at Westminster. King Charles, who had returned to Whitehall Palace for a few hours of rest, was awoken with alarming news. The fire was approaching the Temple, a complex of buildings that housed London's legal profession and contained irreplaceable legal records dating back centuries. If the Temple fell, England's entire legal system could be thrown into chaos. Titles to land, important precedents, the documentary foundation of the nation's laws, all would be lost. Charles immediately ordered more buildings demolished to create a wider firebreak around the Temple. This time he didn't bother consulting property owners. This was a national emergency that required decisive action. The king was also concerned about a more immediate danger. The Tower of London with its armory and gunpowder stores lay in the potential path of the fire. If those gunpowder stores ignited, the resulting explosion would devastate what remained of the city. "Send word to the Tower," Charles commanded. "They are to begin moving the gunpowder to ships on the river immediately." Meanwhile, ordinary Londoners continued their desperate struggle against the flames. Bucket chains formed wherever water was available. Men with firehooks pulled down buildings that hadn't yet caught fire, trying to create gaps the flames couldn't jump. But water was becoming scarce. Many of the pipes from the city's waterworks had melted or been destroyed. The Thames were still accessible, but getting water from the river to the fires was an exhausting, inefficient process involving bucket chains hundreds of people long. And those primitive fire engines I mentioned earlier, they were practically useless against a blaze of this magnitude. Their pumps could only produce a weak stream of water that evaporated before it even reached the flames in many cases. Plus, they had to be constantly refilled from wells or the river, which meant long delays between short bursts of firefighting. Some Londoners had given up on conventional methods entirely and were trying more desperate measures. Milk, beer, even urine were used when water wasn't available. People urinated on their own houses in a futile attempt to save them. I saw a man using blood from a butcher shop to douse his doorway. One witness reported, the fire took his house anyway. Nothing seemed to work. Nothing seemed capable of stopping this relentless, ravenous beast that was devouring London street by street, building by building. By midnight on Monday, the fire had been burning for nearly 48 hours straight. It showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was still growing stronger, fed by the countless wooden structures that made up the medieval city. Our three Londoners, Sybil the shoemaker, Joshua the bookseller, and Robert the banker, were all still ahead of the flames. But for how much longer? The fire was moving faster than anyone had thought possible, confounding every attempt to predict its path or contain its spread. As Monday ended and Tuesday began, London faced the terrifying prospect that this fire might not stop until it had consumed everything in its path. Perhaps the entire city and beyond. The Great Fire was entering its most destructive phase yet, and the worst was yet to come. I once asked a fire captain what it's like inside a major structure fire. You know what he told me? It's like standing at the gates of hell. That's what all of London had become, a portal to the inferno. And somehow people were still living through it, still making desperate choices about what to save and what to abandon, still fighting to protect what was theirs. The truly wild thing is how much stuff people managed to save. In a time with no moving vans, no storage units, no insurance, Londoners somehow evacuated thousands of tons of goods. The Thames were so filled with lighters and boats taking in goods. Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary that a man could walk half a mile into the river on them. Imagine that. The river so packed with boats you could practically walk across it. People's entire lives piled onto whatever vessel they could find. As you drift towards sleep, picture yourself in that moment. What would you save if you had minutes to decide? What would you leave behind? Sometimes it's not until everything is at risk that we figure out what really matters. And while you're cozy in your bed, spare a thought for those Londoners who had no bed at all on that second night of the fire. Just the hard ground of Moorfields, a salvaged blanket if they were lucky, and the terrifying glow of their burning city on the horizon. Tuesday morning, day 3 of the fire. The streets of London had become a vision of hell itself. Black smoke blotted out the sun. The air was thick with ash and embers, and the heat, my God, the heat, you could feel it radiating from the ground, from the walls, from everywhere. For those who'd spent the night in the fields outside the city, dawn brought no relief, just the grim reality that the fire had continued its destructive march through the night. The London they knew was disappearing hour by hour, street by street. From Moorfields, the largest of these makeshift refugee camps, the view of the burning city was both mesmerizing and horrifying. One survivor described it as a sea of fire with flames leaping hundreds of feet into the air as they consumed the taller buildings. Will it ever stop? A child asked her mother, watching the distant inferno. The question hung in the air, unanswerable, because the truth was nobody knew. This fire was defying all expectations, all previous experience. By Tuesday, the situation had become so desperate that conventional firefighting methods were abandoned entirely. King Charles II authorized a radical new approach, using gunpowder to blow up buildings and create massive fire breaks. This wasn't like the small-scale demolitions of the previous days. This was controlled destruction on an unprecedented scale. The king had called in professional soldiers and sailors who knew how to handle explosives. They would place barrels of gunpowder inside buildings that were in the fire's path, then detonate them to create gaps too wide for the flames to jump. It was incredibly dangerous work. The men placing the explosives were literally racing against the approaching fire, working in buildings that might be engulfed at any moment, and the explosions themselves posed risks to nearby structures and anyone who might be in the vicinity. "Clear the street," a soldier shouted as he ran from a row of houses on Cripplegate. "Fire in the hole." The blast that followed shook the ground, sending debris flying in all directions. When the dust cleared, where there had once been 3 adjoining houses, there was now just a smoking crater. And yet, even these extreme measures weren't always successful. In many places, the fire simply leapt across the newly created gaps, igniting buildings on the other side through sheer heat or wind-borne embers. The fire was now burning along a front nearly a mile and a half wide. It had consumed most of the city within the walls and was pushing steadily westward toward Westminster, the seat of government and the King's Palace at Whitehall. Our bookseller, Joshua Curtin, had spent the night in St. Paul's Cathedral with dozens of other merchants, all guarding their goods that had been stored in the crypt for safekeeping. The massive stone cathedral seemed like the one place in London that would surely withstand the flames. Outside, the streets around St. Paul's were filled with desperate activity. People were still trying to move their possessions to safety, though safe places were increasingly hard to find. The churchyard itself had become a storage area piled high with furniture, trade goods, and household items. They say the fires reached Ludgate Hill, a fellow bookseller told Joshua as they stood in the cathedral doorway watching the chaos outside. Ludgate Hill was the main approach to St. Paul's from the east and the direction from which the fire was coming. "How long do we have?" Joshua asked. The man shrugged. "Hours, maybe." "Not long." Joshua looked back at the cathedral's vast interior, now crowded with people's possessions. His life's work, thousands of books, manuscripts, and prints, was piled in the crypt below if St. Paul's fell. But no, that was unthinkable. The cathedral had stood for centuries. Its walls were 5 feet thick in places. If anything in London could withstand the fire, surely it would be St. Paul's. Meanwhile, in the northern part of the city, our shoemaker, Sybil Tame, was frantically packing her tools and materials. Christ's Hospital, where she lived and worked, was still outside the fire's immediate path, but she had decided not to take any chances. "Take only what we need to start again," she told her daughters as they sorted through their belongings. "The rest we can replace." It was easier said than done for a craftswoman like Sybil. Her tools were her livelihood. Each awl, each hammer, each last. The form used to shape shoes represented an investment, and some had been passed down from her late husband, carrying both practical and sentimental value. In the end, they took what they could carry, the most essential tools, some leather, their clothing, and a few keepsakes. Everything else would have to be left to fate. "Where will we go?" her youngest daughter asked as they prepared to leave their home of many years. "West," Sybil said decisively. "Away from the fire, we'll find somewhere." That was the situation for thousands of Londoners, leaving with no clear destination, just the urgent need to get away from the flames. The exodus from the city had now reached biblical proportions. Every road leading out of London was jammed with people on foot, on horseback, in carts, all fleeing with whatever possessions they could transport. Samuel Pepys described the scene in his diary. "The streets and highways are full of people, their goods dragging along on carts and on their backs, all flying from one place to another." But not everyone was fleeing. Some stayed to fight the fire, driven by desperation or duty or simple stubbornness. And some, God help them, saw opportunity in the chaos. Looters moved through abandoned buildings, taking whatever of value remained. Sometimes they were caught and beaten by angry homeowners or arrested by soldiers. But in the confusion of the fire, many escaped with their ill-gotten gains. "I saw a man running with silver plate," one witness reported. "He was laughing like a madman." The crisis was bringing out both the best and worst in people. There were acts of extraordinary courage and selflessness. People risking their lives to save strangers. Sharing what little they had with those who had nothing. And there were acts of shameful opportunism, price gouging, looting, taking advantage of others' misfortune. Pretty much like any disaster today, when you think about it, some rise to the occasion, some sink to new lows. By midday Tuesday, the fire had reached Ludgate, the western gate of the city, and was climbing Ludgate Hill towards St. Paul's Cathedral. The grand old church which had dominated London's skyline for centuries was now directly threatened. Outside the cathedral, pandemonium reigned. People who had stored their goods inside were now trying to get them out again, creating a bottleneck at the doors. Others were still arriving with more possessions, unaware of how dire the situation had become. "Stand back," shouted a member of the Duke of York's firefighting team as he arrived with a squad of men. "The building needs to be cleared." But it was too late for an orderly evacuation. The fire was already licking at the scaffolding that surrounded parts of the cathedral, which was undergoing repairs. The wooden scaffolding caught quickly, and from there the flames spread to the roof. What happened next defied all expectations. The limestone of the cathedral's walls, which everyone thought would withstand the flames, began to crack and explode from the intense heat. Pieces of stone shot outward like cannonballs, striking buildings and people nearby. John Evelyn, who witnessed the destruction, wrote, "The stones of St. Paul's flew like grenades. The melting lead running down the streets in a stream, and the very pavements glowing with fiery redness, so as no horse nor man was able to tread on them. Imagine that. Streets so hot that horses couldn't walk on them without burning their hooves. Lead from the cathedral roof flowing like water down the gutters. It's almost impossible to grasp the intensity of this fire. Inside the cathedral, Joshua Curtin watched in horror as smoke began to filter through the ceiling. The temperature was rising rapidly. People were shouting, pushing toward the exits. "The roof's on fire," someone yelled, triggering a stampede for the doors. Joshua tried to reach the crypt where his books were stored, but the crush of panicking people made it impossible. He was swept along with the crowd out into the churchyard. Outside, he turned to look back at the cathedral just in time to see the great wooden roof timbers collapse in a shower of sparks and flames. The lead that had covered the roof was now pouring down the sides of the building like silvery waterfalls. In that moment, Joshua knew that everything he had worked for was gone. His entire inventory, the foundation of his business and livelihood, was either burning or about to burn. And he wasn't alone. Hundreds of merchants had stored their goods in St. Paul's, believing it to be the safest place in London. All of them were now watching their livelihoods go up in smoke. The fall of St. Paul's marked a psychological turning point for many Londoners. If the mighty cathedral could not withstand the flames, what hope was there for the rest of the city? Yet, even as St. Paul's burned, efforts to stop the fire continued elsewhere. The controlled demolitions using gunpowder were creating wider and wider fire breaks. King Charles and the Duke of York remained personally involved, directing operations and encouraging the firefighters. But the fire seemed to have a mind of its own, finding ways around obstacles, exploiting weaknesses, behaving almost like a living, cunning enemy. One particular concern was the Tower of London, which lay to the east. Although the main fire front was moving westward, driven by the wind, fire doesn't always behave predictably. Sparks and embers can travel in any direction, starting new blazes far from the main front. The tower wasn't just a historic fortress. It was also an arsenal. It contained enough gunpowder to level a significant portion of what remained of the city if it exploded. And now, worryingly, the wind was beginning to shift. "If the fire reaches the tower, God help us all," said an officer of the guard as he supervised the evacuation of gunpowder to ships waiting on the river. By late afternoon, the situation around the tower had become critical. The fire was approaching from multiple directions. Soldiers and citizens formed bucket chains from the river, desperately trying to wet down the buildings surrounding the fortress. In a last-ditch effort, the commander of the tower ordered nearby houses demolished with gunpowder, creating a firebreak just in time. The flames came within yards of the tower's outer walls, but could advance no further. It was one of the few victories in what had otherwise been a relentless retreat before the fire. As Tuesday evening approached, our banker Robert Viner was at his country house in Hampstead, safely outside the city. From the hill there, he and many other wealthy Londoners watched the catastrophe unfold from a distance. The view was apocalyptic. The entire center of London appeared to be engulfed in flames. The sky above the city glowed an unnatural orange-red, visible for miles around. Columns of smoke rose thousands of feet into the air before being bent westward by the persistent east wind. "They say St. Paul's has fallen," said a fellow banker, who had joined Viner on the hillside. Viner nodded grimly. "I saw it go up. The roof collapsed around 3 o'clock. What will be left of the city when this is over?" Viner had no answer. Like everyone else, he was struggling to comprehend the scale of the disaster. London had faced fires before, but nothing like this. Nothing that threatened the very existence of the city itself. For the wealthy like Viner, the fire meant financial loss and inconvenience, but they had resources, options, places to go. For the poor, it meant total devastation. By now, the refugee camps in the fields north of the city had swelled to hold tens of thousands of people. More fields, Finsbury Fields, and other open spaces had become vast, chaotic tent cities. People had improvised shelters from blankets, pieces of furniture, whatever they could salvage. Conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Food was scarce. Clean water was hard to find. Sanitation was non-existent. And with so many people crowded together, disease was a growing concern. "My children haven't eaten since yesterday," a woman told Sybil Tame, who had brought her daughters to Moorfields after leaving Christ's Hospital. Sybil shared the bread she had managed to bring with her, but it wasn't much. Everyone was in the same situation, hungry, scared, uncertain of the future. The king had ordered emergency food supplies brought in from the countryside, but distribution was chaotic. Those with money could still buy food from vendors who had set up impromptu markets in the fields, but prices were exorbitant. Many had to simply go without. As night fell on the Tuesday, the third day of the fire, the situation remained dire. The fire continued to burn fiercely, though the direction of its advance had become less predictable as the wind began to shift. The western part of the city, including Fleet Street and the Temple, was now engulfed. The fire had reached the banks of the Fleet River, a tributary of the Thames that flowed through the western part of the city. Some hoped this natural barrier might stop the flames. But the river was narrow and heavily polluted, more of an open sewer than a proper waterway. Will it cross the Fleet? Was the question on everyone's lips. If it did, the fire would threaten the legal district of the Temple and potentially open a path all the way to Westminster and Whitehall Palace. King Charles, who had returned to Whitehall to rest and confer with his advisors, received updates throughout the evening. The situation remained precarious, but there were some small signs of hope. The wind was dropping slightly. The fire breaks created by the gunpowder demolition seemed to be holding in some areas, but no one was ready to declare victory yet. The fire had confounded all expectations thus far. No one would believe it was contained until they saw it with their own eyes. And so, as Tuesday night deepened, London remained a city in crisis. The fire had been burning for nearly 72 hours without pause. It had destroyed most of the city within the walls and was threatening areas beyond. Thousands were homeless, hungry, and afraid. Yet, even in the midst of this catastrophe, there were moments of remarkable humanity. Strangers sharing what little food they had, people opening their homes to those who had lost everything, neighbors helping neighbors save what could be saved. "We shall rebuild," the king had declared earlier that day. "London will rise again from these ashes." Easy for him to say, perhaps he had palaces. The average Londoner had lost everything. Yet there was truth in his words. Cities are more than buildings. They're communities of people, and while stone and wood might burn, the human spirit is remarkably resilient. As you lie there in your comfortable bed surrounded by all the security of modern life, try to imagine what it would be like to lose everything you own in a single day. Your home, your possessions, maybe even your livelihood. Where would you go? What would you do? These were the questions facing tens of thousands of Londoners as the Great Fire entered its fourth day. With no insurance, no government safety net, no disaster relief agencies, just their own resources and the kindness of others. What comes to mind when I think about these people isn't their suffering, though that was immense. It's their resilience, their ability to face an unimaginable catastrophe and somehow keep going. I'm reminded of something a firefighter once told me. In a disaster, look for the helpers. There are always people helping. Even in the midst of London's greatest calamity, there were helpers everywhere. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things to save their city and each other. But would it be enough? As Tuesday turned to Wednesday, that question remained unanswered. The fire was still burning. The danger was still present, and the fate of what remained of London hung in the balance. "The whole city is but one smoldering ruin," wrote one witness that night. It was hard to argue with that assessment. From certain vantage points, it looked as though all of London was ablaze, with flames visible in every direction. Yet somehow people found the strength to continue fighting bucket by bucket, building by building, street by street, refusing to concede their city to the flames without a battle. And as the wind finally began to drop, ever so slightly there came the first glimmer of hope that the tide might be turning, that the Great Fire, which had seemed unstoppable for 3 days, might finally have met its match in the determination of London's people. The question was whether that determination had come in time to save what remained of the great city. Wednesday morning, September 5, day 4 of the Great Fire. The smoke was so thick now that breathing was difficult even miles from the flames. The sun, when visible at all, appeared as a dim red disk through the haze. From the temporary camps in the fields north of the city, thousands of displaced Londoners watched the continued destruction of their home. The fire had been burning for over 72 hours straight, consuming everything in its path: homes, businesses, churches, public buildings. Nothing seemed capable of stopping it. But something had changed overnight. The relentless east wind that had driven the flames westward for 3 days had finally begun to slacken. And in some areas, the massive fire breaks created by gunpowder demolitions were starting to contain the spread. For the first time since the fire began, there was a sense that the tide might be turning. King Charles, who had snatched a few hours of sleep at Whitehall Palace, was back on the streets at dawn, coordinating the firefighting efforts. His brother, the Duke of York, was doing the same in another part of the city. "The wind is dropping," the Duke reported when they met briefly at midday. "If it holds, we might contain this yet." But even as hope grew that the fire might finally be brought under control, the destruction continued. The western part of the city was still burning fiercely. Fleet Street, the Inns of Court, and parts of the Temple area were all ablaze. And the aftermath of the fire was creating new dangers. Buildings that had been partially burned were now structurally unsound, liable to collapse at any moment. The intense heat had cracked and weakened even stone structures. The ground itself remained so hot in many areas that it was impossible to walk on without burning one's feet. "Watch the walls," came a sudden shout as a group of men tried to salvage goods from a partially burned building on Fleet Street. They scattered just in time as the facade of the structure collapsed outward, sending bricks and timbers crashing into the street. Not everyone was so lucky. Throughout the day, there were reports of people injured or killed by falling debris as they tried to return to their properties too soon. The king had issued a proclamation warning people to stay away from burned areas until they could be properly assessed, but desperation drove many to ignore this order. They wanted to see if anything could be salvaged from the ruins of their homes and businesses. For our bookseller, Joshua Curtin, there was nothing left to salvage. St. Paul's Cathedral, where he had stored his entire inventory, was now just a smoldering shell. The great church that had dominated London's skyline for centuries had been gutted by the flames. "All gone," he muttered as he stood in the churchyard looking at the ruined cathedral. Every last page. Joshua wasn't just facing the loss of his current stock. He was looking at the complete destruction of his business. He had no capital to buy new inventory, no shop to sell from, no way to support himself. Like thousands of other Londoners, he had been reduced to destitution in the space of a few days. The psychological impact of these losses was as devastating as the material impact. People who had worked for decades to build businesses and accumulate property now found themselves with nothing. The certainties and securities of their lives had literally gone up in smoke. In the fields outside the city, our shoemaker, Sybil Tame, was trying to keep her daughter's spirits up despite their grim situation. "At least we have our tools," she reminded them as they huddled under a makeshift shelter in Moorfields. "As long as we have those, we can start again." It was a sentiment repeated in various forms throughout the refugee camps. The determination to rebuild, to start over, to not be defeated by the disaster. But for many, the path forward was far from clear. The fire had destroyed not just homes, but entire industries. The printing trade, the cloth trade, the spice trade, all had been centered in areas that were now in ruins. Thousands of apprentices and journeymen would find their training and skills suddenly worthless if their masters couldn't re-establish their businesses. And even for those who had the means to rebuild, there was the question of where and how. Would the city be reconstructed as it was with its narrow streets and tightly packed wooden houses? Or would this catastrophe lead to a new London built to different standards? These questions were already being debated by the king and his advisors even as the fire continued to burn in parts of the city. "This is an opportunity," Sir Christopher Wren, the king's surveyor, argued in a meeting at Whitehall. "We can rebuild London as a modern city with wide streets, brick buildings, proper sewers." Others were more cautious, pointing out the immense cost and complexity of such an undertaking, and there were legal issues to consider: property rights, leases, the competing interests of landlords and tenants. But those discussions were for the future. In the present, the priority remained bringing the fire under control and providing for the immediate needs of the displaced population. The king had ordered the establishment of temporary markets in the fields where refugees were gathered, ensuring a supply of food at controlled prices. Tents and basic supplies were being distributed. Plans were being made for temporary housing as winter approached. Yet, despite these efforts, conditions in the refugee camps remained difficult. Sanitation was a major concern. Disease was beginning to spread. And with so many people concentrated in small areas, tensions were rising. "They say it was the Dutch," a man was saying loudly to a group gathered around a small fire in Moorfields. "Or the Catholics. Someone did this to us on purpose." This kind of talk had been circulating since the fire began, but it was growing more vehement as people sought someone to blame for their suffering. "I heard they caught a Frenchman with fireballs," someone else added. "Hang them all, I say," another voice called out. Sybil, listening nearby, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had seen mobs form before, had witnessed the swift and terrible justice they could deliver, and she knew how quickly suspicion could fall on anyone who seemed different or foreign. "Come," she told her daughters, moving them away from the angry gathering. "Let's find somewhere else to sit." Similar scenes were playing out across the refugee camps. Rumors and accusations flew. Foreigners and Catholics kept a low profile, fearing they might become targets of mob violence. The king, aware of these dangerous undercurrents, had increased the military presence in and around London. Soldiers patrolled the streets and the refugee camps, maintaining order and protecting vulnerable groups, but they couldn't be everywhere. And as night fell on Wednesday, isolated incidents of violence against foreigners were reported. A French tailor was beaten. A Dutch merchant's temporary shelter was vandalized. A Catholic family was driven out of their camp by hostile neighbors. These were the ugly side effects of disaster, fear, suspicion, the search for scapegoats. Then, as now, catastrophe could bring out both the best and worst in people. Meanwhile, back in the city, the battle against the fire continued. The dropping wind had helped, but the flames were still advancing in some areas, particularly to the northwest. The biggest concern now was that the fire might reach Westminster, where the ancient Abbey, the Houses of Parliament, and Whitehall Palace were located. If these buildings were lost, it would be not just a practical disaster, but a symbolic one, the destruction of the very heart of English government and monarchy. It was a calculated sacrifice, destroying dozens of properties to save hundreds more. And for the most part, the owners of the demolished buildings understood the necessity. Better to lose their property to controlled demolition than to the uncontrolled ravages of the fire. By Wednesday evening, these efforts were beginning to show results. The fire's advance had slowed significantly. In some areas, it had been stopped completely. The fire breaks were holding, but the danger was far from over. The fire still burned fiercely in many parts of the city. Buildings continued to collapse and the risk of new outbreaks remained high. Our banker, Robert Viner, had ventured back into the city that afternoon to check on one of his properties on the northern edge of the fire zone. What he found was sobering. The building itself was intact, having just escaped the flames, but the surrounding area was devastated. The streets were covered in ash and debris. The air was still thick with smoke, and the heat radiating from nearby ruins was intense enough to make his face flush even from a distance. "It will be weeks before it's safe to return," he told his steward as they surveyed the scene, "and months before anything like normal business can resume." Viner was thinking ahead, calculating the financial implications of the disaster, not just for himself, but for the city as a whole. The economic damage was incalculable. London was, or had been, the commercial heart of England. Its destruction would have ripple effects throughout the nation and beyond. But Viner was also thinking about opportunities. He was, after all, a banker. And where there was rebuilding to be done, there would be money to be lent, investments to be made, profits to be earned. "We should set up temporary offices outside the city," he told his steward. "People will need loans to rebuild. They'll need banking services." The steward nodded. "I'll make arrangements, sir." Even in the midst of catastrophe, commerce continued. Life went on. People adapted. As Wednesday night deepened, the fire was finally showing clear signs of weakening. The combination of dropping winds, extensive fire breaks, and the exhaustive efforts of thousands of firefighters was beginning to turn the tide. In some areas, the flames had been reduced to smoldering ruins. In others, they still burned, but with less ferocity than before. And most importantly, the fire's expansion had been largely contained. For the first time since the disaster began, people dared to hope that the worst might be over. But even if the fire was finally being brought under control, its consequences would be felt for years, decades, perhaps centuries to come. London had been fundamentally changed physically and psychologically. The city that had stood since Roman times, that had weathered plagues and civil wars and countless smaller fires, had been brought to its knees in just 4 days. Its medieval heart had been all but erased from the map. What would rise from these ashes remained to be seen, but it could not, be the same London that had existed before. As night fell over the smoldering city, the full moon rose, casting an eerie light over the devastation. From the hills surrounding London, the view was apocalyptic. A vast expanse of ruins stretching for miles, punctuated by the occasional still burning structure. John Evelyn, who viewed the scene from Southwark on the south bank of the Thames, wrote, "London was but is no more." It was a sentiment shared by many that night. The London they had known was gone. Whether it could ever be restored remained an open question. Yet even in this darkest moment there were glimmers of hope. The fire, which had seemed unstoppable for so long, was finally being contained. People who had lost everything were already beginning to think about how to rebuild their lives. And throughout the crisis, there had been countless acts of courage, kindness, and resilience. In Moorfields, Sybil Tame and her daughters had found a slightly better spot to camp away from the angry crowds. They had even managed to erect a more substantial shelter using salvaged materials. "We'll be all right," Sybil told her girls as they settled in for another uncomfortable night on the hard ground. "We have each other. We have our skills. We'll start again." It was a simple declaration of hope in the face of disaster, and it was being echoed in various forms throughout the refugee camps surrounding the burned city. Across the field, Joshua Curtin was having a harder time finding such hope. The loss of his entire inventory of books had left him not just materially destitute, but spiritually crushed. Books had been his life, his passion. Now they were all gone. "What will you do now?" asked a fellow bookseller who had fared slightly better, having managed to save some of his stock. Joshua shook his head. "I don't know. I truly don't know." In that moment of despair, he couldn't see a way forward. The future seemed as dark and ruined as the city itself. But humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. Even in the most dire circumstances, we find ways to survive, to rebuild, to go on. Joshua didn't know it yet, but he would find his path forward, too, in time. As Wednesday night turned to Thursday morning, the Great Fire of London was finally coming under control. There were still fires burning in various parts of the city and would be for days to come, but the worst was over. The most destructive fire in London's history had burned for 4 days and nights. It had destroyed approximately 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, 44 livery company halls and hundreds of other buildings, including the Royal Exchange, Guildhall, and of course, St. Paul's Cathedral. The financial cost was staggering, estimated at around 10 million at the time, equivalent to billions in today's money. And the human cost, while harder to quantify, was no less real. Tens of thousands of people had lost their homes, their livelihoods, everything they owned. Yet, remarkably, the confirmed death toll was very low. Only 6 verified deaths were recorded, though the true number was almost certainly higher. Many of the poorest victims may have gone unrecorded, and some of those who died later from injuries, exposure, or disease related to the fire would not have been counted in the official toll. Still, given the scale of the disaster, it was almost miraculous that more people hadn't perished directly in the flames. The relatively slow spread of the fire during its early hours had given most people time to evacuate. And the fact that it began on a Sunday when many businesses were closed and the warehouses along the river were less busy than usual had probably saved many lives. But these were small consolations to those who had lost everything. As dawn broke on Thursday, September 6, London faced the enormous task of recovery and rebuilding. The immediate challenges were daunting. Tens of thousands of people needed shelter, food, and basic necessities. The burned areas of the city remained dangerous with unstable structures and smoldering ruins. And with winter only a few months away, there was an urgent need for at least temporary housing solutions. Beyond these immediate concerns lay the larger questions of how London would be rebuilt. Would it rise again as it had been with its narrow streets and timber-framed houses? Or would this disaster lead to a new London designed to prevent such catastrophes in the future? These questions would be debated fiercely in the coming days and weeks. But for now, as the sun rose on the fourth day after the fire began, most Londoners were focused on much more immediate concerns. Where they would sleep that night, what they would eat, how they would survive. The Great Fire had tested London as few events in its long history had done. It had revealed both the vulnerability and the resilience of the city and its people, and it had changed the course of London's development in ways that would be felt for centuries to come. As you lie there in your comfortable bed, drifting towards sleep, think about those Londoners on that Thursday morning in September 1666. Think about what it would be like to stand amid the smoking ruins of your city, having lost everything, facing an uncertain future. And then think about the extraordinary human capacity for resilience, for adaptation, for hope in the face of disaster. Because that ultimately is what the story of the Great Fire teaches us, not just about London, but about ourselves. I want you to really picture the scale of this fire. From certain vantage points around London, you could see the entire city centre in flames. The glow at night was visible from 40 miles away. People in Oxford, 60 miles distant, reported seeing the smoke. Samuel Pepys wrote that he observed the saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw. Everywhere great fires, oil cellars and brimstone and other things burning. John Evelyn described the scene as a resemblance of Sodom or the Last Day. London was but is no more. These weren't just poetic exaggerations. The Great Fire really was that catastrophic. It's hard for our modern minds to fully grasp what it would have been like to live through such an event in an age before fire departments, before insurance, before the social safety nets we take for granted today. And yet somehow London survived. Not just survived, but eventually thrived. The city was rebuilt better than before. New regulations required buildings to be made of brick or stone rather than wood. Streets were widened. Fire breaks were incorporated into the urban design. From the ashes of medieval London emerged a more modern city, one that would go on to become the largest in the world by the 19th century. The heart of a global empire. But that was all in the future. For now, as the Great Fire finally burned itself out, London's residents faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding their lives and their city from scratch. The story of how they did that, of London's phoenix-like rise from the ashes, is almost as remarkable as the story of the fire itself. But that's a tale for another night. For now, as you drift closer to sleep, I want you to think about what it means to lose everything and start again. About the resilience that allows people to face unimaginable disaster and somehow find the strength to move forward. Because while the Great Fire of London happened more than 350 years ago, the human experience is at its heart: fear, loss, courage, hope, determination are timeless. They connect us across the centuries to those Londoners who watched their city burn and then somehow found the will to rebuild it. That's what makes history more than just dates and facts. It's about people. People not so different from you and me facing extraordinary circumstances, showing us both the depths of human vulnerability and the heights of human resilience. And as your eyes grow heavy, remember that you're sleeping in a world shaped by countless such stories. Tales of disaster and recovery, destruction and rebuilding, endings and new beginnings. The Great Fire of London is just one thread in that vast tapestry of human experience. Sleep well, knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow brings, you're part of that same human story. A story of remarkable adaptability and endurance in the face of adversity. Thursday morning, September 6th, dawned with a different quality of light. The thick pall of smoke that had blotted out the sun for days was thinning slightly. The air, while still acrid and choking, wasn't quite as dense with ash and embers. For the thousands of displaced Londoners camping in the fields surrounding the city, these small changes brought the first real hope since the disaster began. The winds dropped completely, a man announced as he returned to more fields from checking on his property in the city. they say the fires contained in most areas. The news spread quickly through the makeshift camp, bringing cautious relief to people who had spent 4 days wondering if anything would survive the flames. In your comfortable bed, with your soft pillow and warm blankets, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate what those refugees were experiencing. Most had been sleeping on the bare ground for days. Many had nothing but the clothes they wore and whatever possessions they'd managed to carry out. Food was scarce, water fouled, sanitation non-existent, and hovering over everything was the constant fear that the fire might spread to the very fields where they'd sought refuge. So the news that the fire was finally being contained, that it wouldn't devour what little remained of their city, was like the first gasp of air after nearly drowning inside what remained of the city walls. The situation was looking more hopeful by the hour. The massive firebreaks created by gunpowder demolitions had finally done their work, stopping the flames from spreading further west toward Westminster and Whitehall. The Duke of York, who had been directing firefighting efforts almost without rest since Sunday, surveyed the scene from the western edge of the burned area. "We've contained it here," he told his exhausted team. "But we need to watch for flare-ups. The ground is still too hot in many places." Indeed, the danger wasn't completely over. Though the main fire fronts had been contained, smaller fires continued to burn throughout the devastated areas. Buildings that had been smoldering for days would occasionally burst back into flames, and the intense heat retained by stone and brick structures meant that spontaneous reignition remained a risk. But the worst was over. The Great Fire, which had seemed unstoppable for so long, had finally met its match in the combination of human determination and changing weather conditions. By midday Thursday, King Charles felt confident enough to issue a proclamation stating that the fire was largely under control. He also took steps to address the growing unrest and suspicion that had been building among the displaced population. "Let it be known," the proclamation read, "that after careful investigation, it has been determined that the fire began by accident in a baker's house on Pudding Lane. Any rumors of foreign plots or malicious intent are false and should not be heeded." The king was attempting to head off the wave of anti-foreign sentiment that had been building throughout the crisis. Already, there had been attacks on French and Dutch residents of London, fueled by rumors that they had started the fire as an act of war. But despite the king's proclamation, suspicion ran deep. People wanted someone to blame for their suffering, and accidents seemed too mundane an explanation for a disaster of this magnitude. "They say a Frenchman confessed to starting it," insisted one man in the Moorfields camp, despite the official declaration. "I heard it was the Catholics," said another. Part of a plot to overthrow the king. These rumors would persist for months, even years, despite the lack of evidence. Some Londoners simply couldn't accept that their city had been destroyed by chance by an untended baker's oven. They needed a villain, a conspiracy, something or someone to direct their anger toward. And tragically, some innocent people would pay the price for this misdirected rage. A French watchmaker named Robert Hubert would eventually be hanged for supposedly starting the fire, despite clear evidence that he wasn't even in London when it began. His confession was almost certainly extracted under duress or the result of mental illness. But on that Thursday in September, as the immediate crisis began to recede, most Londoners were focused not on revenge, but on survival and recovery. Our shoemaker, Sybil Tame, was among the first to venture back into the burnt areas of the city. Christ's Hospital, where she had lived and worked, lay just on the edge of the fire zone. She needed to see if anything remained of her workshop. "Stay here," she told her daughters, leaving them in the relative safety of Moorfields. "I'll be back before nightfall." The journey into the city was hazardous. Many streets were blocked by debris or collapsed buildings. The ground in burned areas was still dangerously hot, requiring careful navigation. And there was the constant risk of unstable structures suddenly giving way. Yet Sybil wasn't alone in making this perilous trip. All across the fire zone, people were cautiously returning to check on their properties to see if anything could be salvaged from the ruins of their homes and businesses. What they found was devastating. The fire had been so intense that in many areas nothing remained but scorched foundations. Entire streets had been reduced to ash and rubble. Landmarks that had stood for centuries were simply gone as if they had never existed. "It's like walking through a foreign city." One returning resident remarked, "I don't recognize anything." The disorientation was profound. Streets that people had known all their lives were now unrecognizable. Buildings that had served as navigational reference points were gone. The very geography of the city had been altered by the disaster. When Sybil reached the area where Christ's Hospital stood, she found a scene of partial destruction. The fire had burned right up to the edge of the hospital grounds before being contained. Some of the outlying buildings, including her workshop, had been damaged, but not completely destroyed. Her living quarters were gone, the roof collapsed, and the interior gutted by flames. But the storeroom, where she kept her leather and some of her larger tools, had somehow survived, protected by a thick stone wall that had acted as a firebreak. It wasn't much, but it was something, a foundation upon which to rebuild. As Sybil picked through the remains of her workshop, salvaging what she could, she became aware of others doing the same nearby. The survivors were returning, reclaiming what little the fire had left them. "Found anything worth saving?" asked a familiar voice. Sybil looked up to see Margaret, a seamstress who had lived in the building adjacent to hers. "Some leather, a few tools," Sybil replied. "You?" Margaret held up a small bundle. "My scissors, a bolt of linen that didn't burn." "It's not much." "It's a start," Sybil said. And in those three simple words lay the essence of London's response to the Great Fire. It's a start, a beginning, a first step on the long road to recovery. This attitude, practical, resilient, forward-looking, would characterize much of the city's approach to rebuilding. Londoners didn't waste time lamenting what was lost. They focused on what remained and how to build upon it. Of course, there were practical considerations driving this approach. Winter was coming. People needed shelter, food, work. There was no time for extended mourning when survival itself was at stake. But there was also something deeply ingrained in the London character, a toughness, a pragmatism, a refusal to be defeated by circumstance. These qualities had seen the city through plagues, wars, and previous fires. They would see it through this catastrophe as well. By Thursday afternoon, the king and his advisors were already turning their attention from firefighting to recovery and rebuilding. Meeting at Whitehall Palace, they began to formulate plans for both the immediate relief of the displaced population and the longer-term reconstruction of the city. "We must establish temporary markets immediately," the king declared. "People need food and at fair prices." Within hours, royal proclamations were issued establishing 8 temporary markets in the fields around London. Price controls were imposed to prevent profiteering. Supplies were ordered from the surrounding countryside. The king also directed that public buildings and churches that had survived the fire should be opened to provide shelter for those who had nowhere else to go. Tents and building materials were to be made available for the construction of temporary housing. These measures addressed the immediate humanitarian crisis. But the bigger question remained: how would London itself be rebuilt? Christopher Wren, the king's surveyor and one of the foremost architects of the age, had already prepared a bold plan for a new London. He envisioned wide straight streets arranged in a grid pattern. Grand public squares and buildings constructed primarily of brick and stone rather than wood. "This is our opportunity," Wren argued, presenting his designs to the king. "We can create a modern city, one worthy of your majesty and the nation." Other architects and planners offered their own visions. Some were even more radical than Wren's, proposing to completely redesign the street layout and property boundaries. But such dramatic changes faced significant obstacles. Legal questions about property rights were complex. Who owned the land beneath the burned buildings? Would original property boundaries be respected in the reconstruction? How would disputes between landlords and tenants be resolved? And then there was the matter of cost. A complete redesign of the city would be enormously expensive. Who would pay for it? The Crown, the City of London, individual property owners? These questions would be debated fiercely in the coming weeks and months. But even as the discussions continued, Londoners were already beginning to rebuild on their own initiative, sometimes without waiting for official plans or permissions. Our banker, Robert Viner, was among those taking immediate action, though he had lost several properties in the fire. His wealth and connections allowed him to recover more quickly than most. "We'll establish temporary offices here," he told his steward, indicating a location just outside the burned area, "and begin providing loans for rebuilding as soon as possible." Farriner understood that the reconstruction of London represented not just a challenge but an opportunity. Those with capital to invest with services to offer stood to profit handsomely from the massive rebuilding effort that was about to begin. Of course, this sort of opportunism in the face of disaster has its unsavory aspects. Some would exploit the crisis, charging exorbitant interest rates or buying up land from desperate sellers at far below its value. But it also provided the financial mechanism by which rebuilding could begin quickly without waiting for government action or official plans. Private capital motivated by the prospect of profit would drive much of London's reconstruction. This is how cities have always recovered from disaster, through this complex interplay of public planning and private initiative, of altruism and self-interest, of communal effort and individual enterprise. As Thursday evening approached, the refugee camps in the fields around London began to take on a more organized appearance. The initial chaos was giving way to a crude but functional system. Food distribution points were established. Water was being brought in from uncontaminated sources. Some basic sanitation measures were being implemented. And throughout the camps, people were beginning to form the communities that would sustain them through the difficult months ahead. Neighbors who had fled together stayed together, supporting each other, sharing resources, maintaining the social bonds that had defined their lives before the fire. "We've saved some bread," Sybil told a family who had set up their makeshift shelter near hers in Moorfields. "Enough to share." These small acts of kindness, multiplied thousands of times across the refugee camps, created a web of mutual support that helped many survive who might otherwise have perished in the harsh conditions. Not everyone was so fortunate, of course. The old, the sick, the very young. Many would die in the weeks following the fire, not from the flames themselves, but from exposure, disease, and malnutrition. These indirect victims of the Great Fire often went unrecorded, their deaths not counted in the official toll. But for every tragedy, there were stories of survival, of adaptation, of resilience. London's people, like the city itself, refused to be defined by destruction. As night fell on Thursday, the first stars became visible over London, a sight that had been obscured by smoke for 4 days. The fires within the city were mostly contained now, reduced to isolated pockets that were being systematically extinguished. The immediate crisis was over. The long process of recovery had begun. But the London that would rise from these ashes would not be the same city that had stood before. The Great Fire had created both the necessity and the opportunity for change. The new London would be different in its physical form, in its building practices, in its approach to fire safety, and in countless other ways, both obvious and subtle. And the people who rebuilt it would be changed as well, marked by the experience of having lost everything and found the strength to begin again. As you lie there in your comfortable bed, drifting towards sleep, it's worth reflecting on this resilience, this human capacity to face catastrophe and somehow find a way forward. It's a quality we all possess, though most of us are fortunate enough never to have it tested as severely as those Londoners in 1666. But when disaster does strike, whether it's a fire or a flood, a personal tragedy, or a global pandemic, we draw on this same wellspring of resilience. We adapt, we rebuild, we go on. The story of the Great Fire of London is in the end not just a tale of destruction but of renewal. Not just of loss, but of recovery. Not just of endings, but of new beginnings. And as your eyelids grow heavy, let that thought follow you into sleep. This remarkable human capacity for renewal, for rebirth, for finding hope amid the ashes of despair. In the weeks and months that followed the Great Fire, London began its slow transformation from disaster zone to construction site. The initial shock gave way to determination. The paralysis of loss was replaced by the energy of rebuilding. But this transition wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. The burned area, over 400 acres at the heart of the city, remained a dangerous wasteland for some time. Buildings continued to collapse. The ground stayed hot enough in some places to scorch shoes, and the task of clearing away the rubble was enormous. "It will take years just to remove the debris," one official complained to King Charles. The king, however, was determined to see his capital rebuilt quickly. "Then we shall begin at once," he replied. And begin, they did. Within weeks of the fire being extinguished, teams of workers were clearing rubble from the main streets. Surveyors were mapping property boundaries. Architects were drawing up plans for new buildings. But where would the money come from? The fire had destroyed property worth millions, an almost inconceivable sum in 1666. Insurance as we know it didn't exist. Government disaster relief was minimal. Most people had lost not just their homes but their livelihoods for our three Londoners: Sybil the shoemaker, Joshua the bookseller, and Robert the banker. The financial challenges of recovery varied greatly. Robert Farriner, with his considerable wealth and connections, recovered the most quickly. Though he had lost several properties in the fire, his most valuable assets, his gold, his documents, his trading networks, remained intact. He had moved them to Windsor Castle before the flames reached his home. Within a month of the fire, Farriner had established new offices just outside the burned area and was actively providing loans to those looking to rebuild. Business was booming. The disaster, while personally inconvenient, actually expanded his banking operations. "Everyone needs capital now," he explained to a colleague as they reviewed loan applications. "And those who have it to lend will profit handsomely." It might seem callous, this focus on profit amid such suffering. But in a way, Farriner and other financiers were providing a crucial service. Without their capital, rebuilding would have been much slower, much more limited in scope. The self-interest of investors helped fuel London's recovery, channeling resources to where they were needed most. This is the paradox of disaster capitalism, even as it exploits crisis for profit. It can also accelerate recovery through the rapid deployment of private resources. For Sybil Tame, the path to recovery was more difficult, but still manageable. She had lost her home and workshop, but had managed to save her tools and some materials. More importantly, she still had her skills and her reputation as a reliable craftswoman. By October, Sybil had secured a small space in a shared workshop near Smithfield, just outside the burn area. It wasn't ideal. She had to commute daily from temporary lodgings in Clerkenwell, but it allowed her to resume making shoes for Christ's Hospital. "We were fortunate to salvage these," she told her eldest daughter, showing her a set of shoe lasts that had survived the fire. "Without them, we'd be starting completely from scratch." These wooden forms, shaped like human feet, were essential to a shoemaker's craft. Each represented hours of careful shaping and smoothing. Having them meant Sybil could begin producing shoes immediately without the delay of creating new lasts. It was a small advantage, but in the competitive scramble to re-establish businesses after the fire, such small advantages often made the difference between success and failure. Joshua Curtin, the bookseller, faced the steepest climb to recovery. He had lost everything. His entire inventory of books, his shop, all his business records, and the book trade centered around St. Paul's Churchyard had been particularly hard hit by the fire. 4 weeks after the disaster, Joshua remained in a state of despondent inaction. While others were making plans and taking steps toward rebuilding, he could see no way forward. His entire world had quite literally gone up in smoke. "What will you do now?" people kept asking him. He had no answer. But humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. Even in the depths of despair, seeds of possibility take root. For Joshua, the turning point came through an unexpected connection. A professor from Gresham College, who had been a regular customer before the fire, sought him out in the refugee camp at Moorfields. "Curtin. There you are," the professor said, finding Joshua sitting listlessly by a small fire. "I've been looking everywhere for you, Professor Hook," Joshua acknowledged dully. "What can I do for you?" "I'm afraid I have no books to sell." "Quite the contrary," Hook replied. "I've come to offer you books to sell." Robert Hooke, a brilliant scientist and architect who would later play a key role in rebuilding London, explained that Gresham College had received a large donation of books from sympathizers on the continent. They needed someone knowledgeable to help catalog and eventually sell these volumes. "It's temporary work," Hooke admitted, "but it would provide an income and connections that might prove valuable when you're ready to re-establish your business." For Joshua, this unexpected opportunity was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. It wasn't a complete solution to his problems, but it was a start, a way back into the world of books, a chance to begin rebuilding his life. "When do I begin?" he asked, feeling the first stirrings of hope in weeks. Stories like these, of adaptation, of unexpected opportunities, of gradual recovery, played out thousands of times across post-fire London. The details varied, but the general pattern was the same. Initial despair giving way to tentative hope followed by determined effort to rebuild. This pattern of disaster and recovery is remarkably consistent throughout human history. Whether it's London in 1666, San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake, New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, or countless other examples, the human response to catastrophe follows similar contours. First comes shock and disbelief. Then grief and assessment of losses. Then the painful, painstaking work of rebuilding not just physical structures but lives, communities, systems of support and sustenance. By the end of 1666, the initial shock of the Great Fire had given way to the immense practical challenges of reconstruction. The burned area remained largely a wasteland with only a few buildings rising from the ruins. Most Londoners who had lost their homes were still living in temporary accommodations. Some in the refugee camps that had sprouted in the fields around the city, others in hastily constructed shacks, others crowded into the homes of friends or relatives in unburned areas. Winter was approaching, adding urgency to the housing crisis. The king ordered the construction of temporary shelters on the outskirts of the city, but there weren't nearly enough to accommodate everyone who needed housing. Many simply left London altogether, returning to the provincial towns and villages they had originally come from. Others pushed into the suburbs, accelerating the city's outward expansion. The population of areas like Clerkenwell, Southwark, and the East End swelled as displaced Londoners sought new places to live and work. For those who remained in or near the burned area, conditions were difficult. Basic services had been disrupted. Clean water was scarce in many places. Sanitation was poor. Disease was a constant threat in the crowded temporary settlements. Yet amid these hardships, there were also signs of progress. The king had appointed a commission to oversee the rebuilding led by Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, and other prominent architects and surveyors. They had drawn up regulations for the new buildings, wider streets, brick or stone construction limits on overhanging upper stories. And in February 1667, a special fire court was established to settle disputes between landlords and tenants about who should bear the cost of rebuilding. This court, which operated for almost 10 years, proved crucial in resolving the complex legal issues that might otherwise have stalled reconstruction for decades. By spring of 1667, rebuilding was underway in earnest. The main streets had been cleared of debris. Property boundaries had been re-established. The first new buildings were rising from the ruins. Progress was uneven, of course. Some areas rebuilt quickly while others remained vacant for years. Wealthier districts generally recovered faster than poorer ones. Important public buildings and churches received priority attention and funding. But year by year, brick by brick, London was remaking itself. And in the process, it was becoming a different city. Not just physically, but socially, economically, even psychologically. The new London that emerged from the ashes was more modern, more fireproof, more sanitary in many ways. The narrow medieval streets were widened somewhat. The overhanging upper stories that had allowed the fire to leap from building to building were prohibited in new construction. Building codes required the use of brick or stone rather than timber for exterior walls. These changes didn't happen all at once, nor were they implemented perfectly. Economic pressures, property rights, and simple inertia meant that many of the more ambitious plans for redesigning the city were never realized. The basic street plan of medieval London largely survived despite proposals for a complete redesign with broad avenues and grand squares. But the cumulative effect of even these limited changes was significant. The London that rose from the ashes of 1666 was a city better equipped to prevent and contain fires, more capable of supporting a growing population, more suited to its role as the capital of an expanding commercial empire. For our three Londoners, the years following the Great Fire brought very different fortunes. Robert Viner, the banker, prospered enormously during the reconstruction. His loans financed dozens of new buildings. His connections with the royal court gave him access to lucrative government contracts. By 1670, he had not only recovered from his fire losses, but significantly expanded his wealth and influence.
Sybil the shoemaker experienced a more modest recovery.
She never returned to her old workshop at Christ's Hospital, which was rebuilt without space for her business. Instead, she established a small but successful shop near Smithfield, where she continued making shoes until her retirement in 1680. Her daughters married local craftsmen, and her grandchildren grew up in a London very different from the one she had known before the fire. Joshua Curtin, the bookseller, followed perhaps the most interesting path. His temporary work at Gresham College introduced him to the scientific community of Restoration London, a connection that proved valuable when he eventually re-established his book-selling business. Rather than returning to the rebuilt St. Paul's churchyard, Joshua opened a shop specializing in scientific and philosophical works near the Royal Society in Fleet Street. This focus on a niche market served him well, and by the 1680s he was more prosperous than he had been before the fire. These individual stories reflected broader patterns in post-fire London. Some prospered from the disaster and reconstruction. Others merely survived, rebuilding lives that were similar to but not quite the same as what they had known before, and some never fully recovered, remaining diminished by their losses. Yet, collectively, these thousands of individual journeys added up to the remarkable recovery of London itself. Within a decade of the Great Fire, much of the burned area had been rebuilt. Within 2 decades, the physical scars of the disaster were largely erased, though its memory remained vivid in the minds of those who had lived through it. The centerpiece of the rebuilt city was the new St. Paul's Cathedral, designed by Christopher Wren to replace the medieval structure destroyed in the fire. Construction began in 1675 and would continue for decades, with the cathedral finally completed in 1711. The new St. Paul's was a magnificent achievement, a Baroque masterpiece with its iconic dome rising 365 feet above the city. It symbolized London's phoenix-like rise from the ashes, its renewal and transformation in the wake of disaster. And nearby stood another monument to the Great Fire. Quite literally the monument, a 202-foot stone column designed by Wren and Hooke. Completed in 1677, it was positioned exactly 202 feet from the spot on Pudding Lane where the fire began. An inscription on its base told the story of the disaster and the city's subsequent renewal. These structures, along with the 51 new churches that Wren designed to replace those destroyed in the fire, gave the rebuilt London a distinctive architectural character. They represented not just recovery, but improvement. The city returning stronger, more beautiful, more resilient than before. This narrative of beneficial destruction, of disaster creating opportunity for positive change, is common in the aftermath of urban catastrophes. And there's often truth to it. The Great Fire did lead to improvements in London's building standards, street layout, and fire prevention measures. It did clear away some of the most overcrowded, unsanitary parts of the medieval city. But such narratives can also obscure the real human suffering that disasters cause. They can gloss over the fact that recovery is almost always uneven, that some people and communities bounce back much more easily than others, that vulnerability before a disaster often translates into vulnerability after it as well. The Great Fire of London was no exception to this pattern. While the city as a whole recovered and even prospered in the decades following the fire, not everyone shared equally in this revival. The poorest Londoners, who had lost what little they had in the flames, often remained impoverished. Those without political connections or financial resources frequently found themselves pushed to the margins of the rebuilding process. Yet despite these inequities, the overall story of London's recovery from the Great Fire remains remarkable. Within modern disaster response systems, without insurance or government relief programs, without the technology and resources we take for granted today, London has nonetheless managed to rebuild their city with astonishing speed and efficiency. This achievement speaks to something fundamental about human resilience, our capacity to face catastrophe and somehow find a way forward. To stand amid the ruins of what we've lost and begin again. To transform disaster into opportunity, endings into new beginnings. It's a capacity we've demonstrated throughout history in countless contexts. From London in 1666 to New York in 2001, from earthquake-ravaged cities to war-torn countries, from personal tragedies to global pandemics. And it's a capacity we'll undoubtedly need in the future as we face new challenges and disasters. Some of our own making, others beyond our control. As you drift towards sleep in your comfortable bed, in your safe home, surrounded by all the security of modern life, it's worth reflecting on this resilience, this stubborn human refusal to be defeated by disaster. It's a quality we all possess, though most of us are fortunate enough never to have it tested as severely as those Londoners in 1666. But when disaster does strike, whether it's a fire or a flood, a personal tragedy or a global crisis, we draw on this same wellspring of resilience. We adapt. We rebuild. We go on. The story of the Great Fire of London reminds us of this capacity. It shows us that even the most devastating losses don't define us. That what matters most is not what we lose, but what we do next. How we respond, how we rebuild. And in this, the Londoners of 1666 have something important to teach us across the centuries that separate us from them. Something about courage and resilience, about adaptation and renewal, about the remarkable human ability to find hope amid the ashes of despair. As you sleep tonight, may you carry that lesson with you, that quiet confidence that whatever challenges tomorrow brings, you possess the same resilience that allowed London to rise from the ashes, stronger and better than before. The Great Fire of London happened over 350 years ago, but its lessons remain as relevant as ever. Disasters will come as they always have, but so will recovery, renewal, rebirth, if we have the courage and determination to make it happen. Sleep well, knowing that you're part of this ancient human story of falling and rising again, of endings and new beginnings, of destruction and creation. A story that continues with each new day, with each new challenge, with each new opportunity to demonstrate the resilience that is our shared inheritance. And in your dreams, perhaps you'll see London as it once was, medieval, wooden, vulnerable, and then as it became a city of smoke and flame, of devastation and loss, and finally as it rose again a city of stone and brick, a phoenix city rising from its own ashes. A testament to the human spirit that refuses to be conquered even by the most terrible calamities. Just as you would refuse to be conquered should disaster ever find you. Just as you would find a way forward even through the darkest times. Just as you would rebuild whatever was lost. Because that's what we do. That's who we are. That's the story of London after the Great Fire. And it's our story, too. A story of remarkable resilience in the face of adversity. A story that continues night after night, day after day, generation after generation. A story without end. Sleep now and be at peace. Whatever tomorrow brings, you'll face it with the same resilience that has carried humanity through countless disasters before. The same resilience that allowed London to rise again after the flames had done their worst. The same resilience that sleeps within you now, waiting for the moment when it might be needed, ready to help you rebuild whatever may come. Sleep well and dream of phoenix cities rising from the ashes, of new beginnings born from endings, of hope rekindled from the embers of despair. This is the gift the Great Fire of London offers us across the centuries. A reminder of our capacity for renewal, for rebirth, for finding our way back from the brink of catastrophe. A reminder that while disasters may destroy our buildings, our possessions, even our livelihoods, they need not destroy our spirit, our community, our determination to begin again. Sleep now carried on gentle dreams of resilience and renewal. Tomorrow is another day. Another chance to demonstrate the same courage and determination that allowed London to rise from the ashes of 1666. Another chance to write your own story of resilience, whatever challenges may come your way.